So before, what I'd like to do maybe is, we'll start just by watching basically the opening 5 minutes of the film, just because I think a lot of people haven't seen it, so at least it will give a bit of a tone of the film, and the initial counter that's going to basically constitute the primary substance of my discussion, which is the encounter with a corpse named Harry Warp. And before then we watch the film, I'd just like to read a brief paragraph that will sort of serve as an epigraph that I won't talk about explicitly in the paper, but I think hopefully will set an interesting frame. And it's a passage from André Breton's The Ideas of a Painter, where he's discussing a studio visit with André Derain. So Derain speaks with emotion about the white dot. And what I'm going to do here is just simply substitute white for red, and you'll see momentarily why. So Derain speaks with emotion about the red dot that certain Flemish or Dutch still life painters of the 17th century used to highlight a vase or a fruit. Always mysteriously and admirably placed, this dot could not be perceived by them. It in fact bears no relation to the color of the object or its luminous sheen, and nothing justifies its presence in terms of composition. We know that the artist in question frequented alchemists' laboratories. This observation is crucial. If someone lights a candle in the dark and then draws it away from my eye until I can make out only the flame, the height of that flame and my distance from it elude me. It becomes no more than a red dot. The object I paint, or the creature before me, does not live until I've made this red dot appear on it. The important thing is to place the candle well.
that's your shooting for the day. If we hadn't rung up at least 2 rabbits, we deserve to go home empty-handed. Yeah, still, blessed do they who expect nothing, for they shall not be disappointed. Fewer things in life give a man more pleasure than hunting. It satisfies his primitive nature, striding through the woods, picking up his kill. Well, come on, old faithful. There's plump rabbits waiting for the frying pan. Through the heart. Escape, I've done him in. A harmless pot shot of a rabbit and I'm a murderer, a killer. Mother always said I'd come to a bad end. What in Hades were you doing here anyway? I can't say that I've seen you around here before. No. If you're going to get yourself shot, do it where you're known. Harry Warp, 87 Maple Avenue, Boston, Massachusetts. Well, Warp, you had a long way from home. But the looks of it, you won't get back for Christmas. No. You've got to have a cold, hard winter. You might keep here a long time, an awful long time. Too long for me, Harry. Yes. Listening?
What seems to be the trouble, Captain?
Well, what you might call an unavoidable accident. He's dead.
Yes.
So, well, that should be at least an invitation to watch the film. Yeah.
Is the AC on? Can we have on? Yeah, we can.
So that should hopefully be an invitation to watch the film if you haven't, because it's definitely a singular film of Hitchcock's in a rather singular corpus, and so hopefully I'm going to hardly do justice to the film because I can't really talk about the richness of its dialogue in particular, which I think really merits like a very close exegesis, which I won't be able to do here. So perhaps then let me just begin then with the adage that we that we heard there from Captain Wiles to sort of protect myself in advance. Blessed are those who expect nothing, for they won't be disappointed. So there's nothing more troubling. Actually, maybe let me before I start, let me just get a better. There's an image.
Just go to the.
Shit.
Just click on
God. What the hell? Sorry, it's the sheer chaos here. Okay, yes. Let me do this one. How do, yeah.
Very well.
Thanks. So I'll leave that. So just as the image that will, and I'll talk about this image in particular at the end of the paper. Okay. So there's nothing more troubling than finding oneself in the very place of the void. And this is indeed the trouble with Harry, Hitchcock's comedy about a corpse, as he has succinctly put it. Harry, like all corpses, finds himself, structurally speaking, in the very place of his absence. And the dark humor of the film derives from the gap that incessantly opens between Harry the person, that bearer of a proper name, that assigns him a social place as a human among humans, and for whom one might expect at least a modicum of concern, and his thingly substance, which suddenly obtrudes into the very place of the name, like feet sticking out from a bathtub. There's a famous scene later in the film where Harry's feet are sort of sticking out. And this is sort of the theme. Obviously, this image already captures it, but probably the dominant representation of Harry is precisely feet sticking out. First with shoes, then with socks, and then bare feet. So Harry Warp's loss of the vertical, making him all woof and no warp, divides him, splitting his life in two, between the person, good or bad, he was, with all the qualities that accrued to this name, and the mere obstacle he has become, a hunk of meat that can be weighed in stone. The film effects a remarkable transformation. This most troubling of quantities, dead human, loses its quality of being unsettling by becoming a mute obstacle that unsettles, albeit literally, a thing at first stumbled upon, then over, kicked, nudged, and dragged, buried and dug up twice, dumped into a bathtub, then examined by Dr. Greenbow, before finally being tidied up and replaced to his original position. That was maybe the plot overview I'll give you. Throughout these series of displacements, Harry, of course, remains unaffected, underscored by Hitchcock's concerted effort, as he himself puts it, to never show Harry in an uncompromised light. This is a quote. Although the action unfolds in the course of a single day, the film begins green and ends red. It was essentially a counterpoint. Nothing ugly should enter the picture. The autumn colors are magnificent, and you may have noticed that I never show the corpse in a way that could be disagreeable, right? So I think like what's interesting is sort of, especially just from the opening sequence that we saw, I mean, it's the only tracking shot in the whole film is in the animated section, which is quite interesting, which is precisely the formal trope of the vertical. I mean, of the horizontal, sorry. So the only horizontal movement of the camera lies at the beginning, and then throughout, rather, the horizontality is precisely the object of the film as such, namely Harry, who has been deprived of his verticality. He is horizontal. And at one point in the film, there's a funny sort of discussion where where his wife, played by Shirley MacLaine, who is sort of hardly perturbed by the discovery of his absence, says that well, Harry is the same, in other words, sort of repulsive or repugnant, even though he's quite a handsome fellow, but she finds him repugnant. And Marlowe says, well, why do you find him so? I only saw him when he's dead. And he's like, well, he's the same, he was the same while he was alive, only vertical, right? So there's this sort of interesting relation that's being thought about verticality and horizontality in terms of the grid or the graph, let's say. So back to that Hitchcock quote. So he never shows the corpse in a disagreeable way. And this subtraction of the corpse from the logic of its inexorable decay serves to highlight what is in fact the central comic device of the film. Far from awakening grave concern, horror, or disgust, as one would expect, Harry's corpse is addressed by all those who encounter him with an attitude of disconcerting nonchalance, as Truffaut notes, discussed as casually as if they were talking about a pack of cigarettes. Nobody seems troubled by Harry's absence. It is this fundamental lack of concern that unsettles the subject's relation to meaning, situating not only Harry, but we spectators beyond good and evil. The trouble with Harry, what makes him an unsettling figure, does not concern his absence, the absence of his presence. If Harry unsettles, it is all too literal. He makes thought stumble by removing the grounding beneath its feet, that is, beneath thought's feet, making language careen towards the literal, where it touches upon the very space of its own null presence. If nothing stands to reason these days, as Captain Wiles suggests, it is because there is no reason to stand. Better to lie flat. Harry does not stand to reason because, quite simply, he does not stand. Riveted as he is to the horizontal in all the splendor of rigor mortis. It is not then his absence that is a matter of concern, but the very obstacle of his thingly presence. The world is warped by the presence of Harry's absence. It is the shift in stress from an absent presence to a present absence that makes Harry a disconcertingly comical object. If corpses, generally speaking, must be buried, incinerated, burned on pyres as was the ancient Greek practice, dusted into urns, scattered or dissolved, like styrofoam in an acetone bath, it is not simply to lay stress in memoriam to an absent presence, but to dispense with a present absence. Yet each attempt to dispense with Harry is met with frustration, and the only one unharried, that is not beset by problems by the whole affair, is Harry himself, who remains blissfully removed, that is to say absent, throughout his various displacements, occupying the pure space of his resting place. The trouble with Harry is all too literally his subject matter. He is both the presence that troubles and the absence about which the characters speak. Harry Warp thus names that which can only be named through the process of its own undoing. The presence of Harry's corpse serves to undo the sense of his name by marking his absent place, the place that is present only in the space of his absence. Harry is unnamed, unharried, as I already suggested, by being deprived of the vertical, unwarped. So we have a kind of interesting double negation of the name. Harry is unharried, and Warp is unwarped. And that happens, then, therefore, creates a warping of space. This is the sort of the argument I've already made the argument, I guess. So Harry Warp names a warped presence. Something is warped when the seam between a thing and its place becomes unstitched, marking a separation between the thing's structural place and the form of its appearance. That which is absent is made present only through the displacement of its sense. The film then is not about Harry, but the place he occupies, the void marked by his null presence. Harry, like all bodies destined to be placed in the ground, is a hole in a thing he is not. He is not simply placed into a hole, but is the hole that is present in the act of placing. So his corpse makes present the hole that he occupies, that can only be seen through this double negation of the name. This is the sort of... hopefully then the general architecture of this paper, which hopefully at least the beginning part's clear. The next part, is a little bit harried, let's say. But the general movement is to really trace this movement within, this from an absent presence to a present absence. This is kind of what I want to do. And I'm going to do so through an interpretation of the concept of suspense in Hitchcock, which is obviously, Hitchcock is the master of suspense. And I think there's an interesting reversal that takes place. In other words, suspense shifts from one register to the next with The Trouble with Harry. So this is a kind of singular film in the sense that it's the obverse of the entire Hitchcockian universe and kind of undoes, let's say, the law that governs it. I don't know if I exactly will be able to really make this argument. I mean, I don't have the time, and also I just think I didn't do it yet, but I mean, that was what I would like to do. Okay, so I'll begin then with a brief sort of account of then the concept of suspense. If we are to trust Pascal Bonitzer, Hitchcock in high Nietzschean mode proposes, and this is supposedly a quote from Hitchcock, but I haven't yet managed to track it down. This is according to Pascal Bonitzer. Hitchcock says to divide humanity, that he proposes to divide humanity in two. Those people that are one and those that are zero. Assigning himself to the latter. Those who count for nothing. Now that's not Hitchcock, that's me now at this point. Those who count for nothing, whose being consists in marking the place of an absence. So Hitchcock's place in the history of cinema, whether we refer to ourselves to the Cahiers or to Deleuze, consists in introducing the problem of point of view, of the relation of the frame, we can say the absent frame to some degree, as that which serves to inscribe a positive relation to an absence. Like Lacan's numbskull, or simpleton, who says that he has three brothers, Paul, Ernest, and me, failing to take into account the manner in which the one who counts must be counted out, he counts himself as an object whose absence must count for something. Hitchcock, with his cameo roles, placing himself within the frame, assumes the position of the fool. If I am me, subject and object, outside and inside the film, I am not one but two. Insisting on counting the presence of the absence. But can one count the presence of an absence? This is what I'm claiming. So of course you can count the absence that is presently included, but to count the presence of the absence, qua presence, that's the claim, that there's something then in the law of the count that falls out of the count, and that I think this film is dealing with. And as you notice that the initial part of the film begins with the three gunshots, and the logic of the film begins with this count, and Captain Wiles then assumes guilt on the basis of the thought that he thinks that the third shot hit its mark. It's rather interesting that there's a sort of very attention to the two bullet holes, right? These absent holes in number 1 and 2. The third hole we assume is the red dot on Harry's head, right? Obviously, Captain Wiles doesn't expect it too closely, but then the logic of the film serves to undo because in fact then Arnie shows up with a rabbit that takes the place of so you can deduce then at that point that he can't be the killer. And the film proceeds in this way of undoing the guilt of each subject that quickly assumes the guilt. So I'll walk through that too. So like the melancholic, so after the simpleton is the one who shows us the place of the absent. Okay, so the simpleton then is the one who shows us the place of the absent. Like the melancholic who won't let absence be, the trouble with Harry is that his absence is woefully present. The corpse insists on counting this absence as present. If Hitchcock is a master of suspense, it is because he realizes that the function of such a cinema is to play with the inscription of the subject. The subject's formal inscription within the frame is an all too present absence. So we have then the inscription of the subject within the frame as an absent presence, and nonetheless this problem of the corpse appearing as presentation of absence. And it's precisely, obviously, that there's a non-reversibility between those is what I'm trying to claim. So as Hitchcock often stressed, the key to suspense, his capacity to create suspense without resorting to violence, as he puts it, is a sense of humor. And he often stresses this. This is not simply due to the fact that humor provides a counterpoint to fear, a release of tension that marks the deviation and restoration of a norm, that is to say, a return to comfort. This would be the joke's function of simply breaking the ice, of establishing a social relation that exceeds the formality of an introduction, right? Or unsettles the formality in order then to allow each subject to take its place within a social exchange. Suspense is not a matter of triggering an instinctual response, the body's reflexive withdrawal from an approaching flame, but a matter of establishing a complicity between the position of the camera and the subject qua spectator that is violently shattered. So brought together and complicitly brought together and then suddenly violently shattered. And oftentimes the moment of laughter sets up either the shattering or also then serves to dispel the disturbance of that splitting. So as Hitchcock says, quote, "I play with people's emotions, it's true. I know how to prepare them, how to give them a laugh at the right moment, and I know how to make them react by clutching their seats with fear." Something I'll return to. Clutching their seats with fear, almost screaming, because I know that they will finally go out giggling. If you take the average fairground midway, you will find people paying to be frightened. The haunted house... Yeah. Okay. I'll just speak over the Harley Davidson. If you take the average fairground midway, you will find people paying to be frightened. The haunted house, for example, where the floorboards move up and down, skeletons pop up, spiders drop down, and it's all done on the basis of humor. So that's Hitchcock. Fear and humor share a similar structure that depends on suspense. The interval between action and reaction, that delay that suspends the position of the subject in its place, playing with the manner in which the subject is not one with itself. And therefore it can then be identified with a figure, let's say, in the imaginary universe of the film. Suspense positions that subject in the very place of its absence, bracketing temporarily the comfort of the subject position, making it return all the more, and making then the return of that subject position all the more enjoyable. So the suspense suspends this relation and then returns it, and that return then produces the giggles that Hitchcock is talking about. So in this sense, Hitchcock acknowledges the ridiculous effrontery of those who claim that films like North by Northwest and even Psycho are unconsciously funny. And he has one of the CIA agents say in North by Northwest, which I think is a key to the film, "It's so horribly sad, I feel like laughing." Now this is another quote from Hitchcock. I'm going to cut some of it out just because I'm a little bit worried about time. But he's here then talking about Psycho. And he says, "Of course, I'm doing it," namely Psycho, with tongue-in-cheek. "Psycho was the biggest joke to me. I couldn't make Psycho without my tongue in my cheek. If I'd been doing Psycho seriously, then it would have been a case history told in documentary manner. It certainly wouldn't have been told in terms of a mystery and, ooh, look out audience, here comes the bogeyman. This is like telling a story to a little boy. It's like telling a fairy story. You tell it in hushed tones, shh. And then the woman went up the stairs. That's all I'm doing. And you've got to have a sense of humor to do this." Hitchcock's films in general, I think, function like traps. And Hitchcock never shied away from asserting his fundamental malevolence, that is, and his sort of Sadian proclivities, his intention to torture the audience. Yet this torture is not administered by means of shocks. That is, Hitchcock was always careful to distinguish his concept of suspense from that of mere surprise. Hitchcock embraced a cinema of mass manipulation of affects as an art that traded necessarily on emotional identification, most certainly, the capacity for empathy, attachment, and psychic investment, and most pivotally of all, betrayal. Yet this involvement of the audience within the drama of a picture served as an initial condition, a joke, so to speak, that on the surface appears to disarm the audience so as to soften its defenses. Hitchcock stresses the importance of hooking the audience, but the Hitchcockian hook is genuinely barbed. It's like a fish hook. The audience is made to feel the prick and is structurally positioned as the butt of a joke. This is the function of the much discussed MacGuffin, the device, we could say, that unavoidable accident that sets the cinematic machine in motion and serves to lure the audience into the trap, as long as the characters within this imaginary universe don't acknowledge its nothingness. The meaningless event that disappears to the degree that the audience is absorbed, ensnared by the very action it occasions. Hitchcock likens the pleasures of film to the taxidermy trophies of the hunter. And so one can think of the scene in Psycho and many other films where you actually have depictions of the taxidermied animals around the film. Around the scenes. So Hitchcock likens the pleasures of film to the taxidermy trophies of the hunter, a constant reminder of the game of cinema, that the game of cinema is that of hunter and prey, and that the eye is to be trapped, ensnared, lured, tricked, and perhaps eventually plucked out, as in The Birds. So cinema is the refinement of a structure that is laid bare in Hitchcock's oftentimes rather crude taste for the practical joke. And I'm going to read what I feel is clearly the most sinister of the practical jokes, but there's a long list of them. So as Donald Spoto recounts in his biography, The Dark Side of Genius, and this is Spoto, Hitchcock bet a film's property man a week's salary that he would be too frightened to spend the whole night chained to a camera in a deserted and darkened studio. The chap heartily agreed to the wager, and at the end of the assigned day, Hitchcock himself clasped the handcuffs and pocketed the key. But not before, so he put the handcuffs on, locked them to the camera, but not before he offered a generous beaker of brandy, the better to ensure, as he said, a quick and deep sleep. The man thanked him for his thoughtfulness and drank the brandy, and everyone withdrew. When they arrived on the set the next morning, they found the poor man angry, weeping, exhausted, and utterly humiliated. Hitchcock had laced the brandy with the strongest available laxative, and the victim. I'm the only one who laughs at this. Okay. Hitchcock had laced the brandy. So Hitchcock had laced the brandy with the. Okay, Hitchcock had laced the brandy with the strongest available laxative, and the victim had unavoidably soiled himself and a wide area around the feet and the camera. Okay, so that's real life, so to speak. Now this deeply sinister joke that completely shatters the limit of good humor does not simply lay bare Hitchcock's excremental fascination. He named one of his dogs, after all, Philip of Magnesia, after the brand, this is true, after the brand Phillips of Magnesium, a laxative. It exposes the manner in which the suspense does not simply make one clutch one's seats in jolly good fun, but toys with making one lose one's shit, altogether literally. Hitchcock's brutal practical joke turns on the most crude of MacGuffins, Kalish cash payment, which is the same device that Hitchcock makes use of in Psycho. $40,000 is that unavoidable accent whose presence warps the course of Marion Crane's, played by Janet Leigh's, banal secretarial existence, positioning her in relation to that nothing she's destined to become. And all too abruptly, since she is murdered in the middle of the film. So sugarcoating the plot planning pill. This is how Hitchcock on another occasion speaks about the role of comedy in his thrillers. Sugarcoating the plot planning pill with a beaker of brandy, Hitchcock stages a drama that will rage in the poor cameraman's bowels, testing the capacity of this poor man, to hold one's shit, turning him into the enemy of his own body, whose natural rhythm had been unduly toyed with. Now, Hitchcock's cinema is, of course, less excessive. The paying customer does not pay the same price for his pleasure, nor is he forced to come to grips with the humiliation of his defeat. Yet it reveals the register in which we should understand suspense in Hitchcock, the manner in which loads the formal content of the image with the weight of an absence that irreparably alters its scene. As Pascal Bonitzer remarks, just out of curiosity, am I fine with time, or am I going way over? Okay. So as Pascal Bonitzer remarks, anyways, just let me know if it's going on. As Pascal Bonitzer remarks, suspense in Hitchcock turns upon the marking of the stain, the drop of blood, in the babbling brook that destroys the pastorality of the scene, riveting the subject to the gaze, that point within the image that marks the absence of his presence, making him less than nothing. So that's how it obviously would be understood, let's say, in broadly Lacanian terms. So Hitchcock introduces into cinema the position of the subject, a relation that forever ruins the innocence, the, quote, original exuberance of cinema's early burlesque days, in which the camera remains trained, as Bonitzer puts it, upon an uninterrupted flow of gestures with pumping legs, flailing arms, and rolling eyes, the burlesque, in other words. So joyful and dirty, like an infant gleefully at home in its excremental filth, early cinema constructs a slapstick cosmos, riddled with banana peels, where however much the protagonists slip, they are in principle immortal and indestructible. Violence is universal and inconsequential, this is Bonitzer, and guilt does not exist. Introducing the position of the subject, the stain, by marking the differential place of the camera's point of view, Hitchcock places the subject into the picture as a kind of marionette or a corpse, a neutral and impassive face whose effects are created as the differential relations that obtain through the course of montage. And so what Bonitzer has in mind here is the actor, the Japanese actor Sesu Hayakawa from Cecil B. DeMille's The Cheat, and his technique known as haragai. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, surely not. But the technique known as haragai, which means literally art of the stomach, which is kind of interesting in relationship to the practical joke, than in the sort of the bodily pressures, let's say, that suspense puts one's under. It's an art of the stomach. The Japanese actor's technique was thus one of holding back, by contrast with the theatrical expressivity of Western acting in that period. And one should, of course, note that Hitchcock is famous for basically asking his actors to do little as possible. And he'll basically construct the performance after the fact, which is not always evident necessarily, but that was obviously at least his ideal. So point of view is interiorized as the actor is liquidated of all expression, becoming a marionette. The weight of death, murder and crime have meaning only through the proximity then of the gaze, that is the relation of one frame to the next, that ultimately and irreparably alters the scene, such that you can have a sort of thing that's rather innocent unfolding. And Bonitzer does a wonderful job just talking about taking up early stills from Lumiere, and that when you suddenly just suggest that there's a crime that's taken place, suddenly, like a father playing with his son, bouncing on his knees, takes on obviously a horrendously hideous overtone, even though nothing has changed. And so this is what he has in mind here about the interiorization of point of view and the rendering of the image in some sense guilty. It owes its a debt, and the subject then is inscribed within that place in the image. So all Hitchcock then has done in his films, and this is Vonitzer, is to make the best possible use, where staging is concerned, of the function of the gaze laid bare by crime. For Hitchcockian suspense to arise, very little is required, at least as far as narrative is concerned. It is sufficient to announce, by means of some artifice or other, a catastrophic event affecting the lives of the characters in the film, the assumption being that they do not question it. So the advent of the cinematic subject, in this interiorized point of view, marking the presence of the gaze through the invention of, amongst other things, the close-up, so this sort of decapitation of the subject from its body, focusing attention upon the object of concern is that which stands in relation to a determining absence, namely the cut, right, the frame. So one is forced by cinematic relation, montage, to not simply indulge in the carnivalesque image, but to judge, to hold that image account, right? And this is often referred to Liz as well as being introducing thought into image. So the action image produces then the thought in a thought image, which is precisely a relation, the image of relationality as such that appears. So this is kind of a rendering the image guilty, as I've put it, and therefore allowing it to take its place within the structure of the film. So the cut then marks the relation of each part and allows it to assign its place within the whole. Now, let me then shift from now to the trouble with Harry. And to do so, let me just pass by way of Eric Romer and Claude Chabrol, because we might say then the trouble with Harry, as I've already that I described in my introduction, is, or you could understand it as a return to the carnivalesque, right? Then, in other words, that it is precisely this absence of guilt, that the subjects are all beyond good and evil, that structures the film. But at the same time, obviously, it's in some sense absolutely not carnivalesque, in the sense that as Hitchcock emphasizes, the corpse is almost approached as a mathematical point, right? There's absolutely nothing bodily. It's not the excess. Hitchcock obviously restricted his excremental fantasies to, his private life. So, and this is precisely what troubles Eric Romer and Claude Chabrol in their very Catholic reading of Hitchcock. The absence of guilt in The Trouble with Harry. This is a quote. Here we join the characters in their pleasure over poor Harry's death. So this is them. Here we join the characters in the pleasure over poor Harry's death. The comic mode allows the auteur to solicit our complicity more than he had been able to do previously. We ourselves are no better than these shoddy or cynical beings, right? Even though I should add, right? I mean, my experience of the film is not at all that the characters are shoddy and cynical. So I think it's quite interesting that they impose. I mean, well, it's quite explicit, this imposition of this Catholic reading, and then therefore the exception of Harry marks this kind of perverse deviation from a Hitchcock that is attentive to the moral problem of guilt. So this is Hitchcock, they say, at his most misanthropic. And this is a nice quote. Most deliberately negative. It shows us the obverse of the coin without indicating to us, as elsewhere, that it is only the obverse. It even lacks the idea of fascination, of vertigo, or of danger. It is the film in which the characters are most lacking in flesh, and in which they always behave like marionettes. So I have a little sort of excursus then on the MacGuffin, but maybe I'll just skip over that. where there's just, I can just quickly sum it up, is that here then Harry, we could say, is not only the most macabre, but the most literal of Hitchcock MacGuffins. In other words, he's the unavoidable accident that occasions the film, but far from other Hitchcock MacGuffins, which always then recedes, and the film unfolds, it constantly drives the film precisely by the constant and incessant return. So it is precisely the literalization of this place of absence, the MacGuffin, through the sort of the presence of the corpse. The presence then that requires then this splitting of the name between Harry, qua sensible name, right, that has its position within a structural universe, and the corpse that can't be placed, right? That there's okay. So let me skip then. I'm skipping to over the MacGuffin, and on to then what I would like to then try to wrap up with, and I'll move into an interpretation, let's say, just of this one image. So what is remarkable about the film is that the spectacle of mortal conflict for a crime, right, that one would expect, that generally accompanies the specter of crime and punishment and death, especially when a film opens up a corpse. For a crime then that is consequently proven that they did not commit. I added that a little bit down. So what is remarkable about the film is that the spectacle of mortal conflict that generally accompanies the specter of crime and punishment is altogether absent. Each character assumes responsibility, albeit too quickly, right? So far from trying to distance each character, then it almost just jumps to the conclusion that they themselves are guilty, but they don't feel at all any guilt. So this is what's amazing about it. So they immediately accept responsibility for the corpse, but they don't feel bad about it. Rather, they try to get rid of the corpse, right? So that they're quickly accepting responsibility, then to double down then on the presentation, to get rid of this absence. So they double down on this. They assume responsibility, and then seek to hide their crime. Not because of any sense of guilt, but in order to maintain its absence. That is to say, to keep the specter of the law at bay, right? So that, in other words, they have a purely external relation to the law. And what I think is really fascinating about this film, and why it's a quintessential comedy, is that the law of comedy is far from internalization of the law. It's this sort of radical exteriorization of it. And so then it's this displacement of the law, and this is its sort of radicality, and I think its real interest. And my effort is to try to really conceive of this structure of externalization of the law through this sort of transposition of a relation of absent presence to present absence. And I think that's precisely the movement, let's say, that allows for this exteriorization of the law, rather than its internalization, which then would allow the subject to mark itself precisely as absent, right? And then the course of the film is always to retain that absence, right? So that generally speaking, if someone dies, one wants to be remembered, or want to have others remember them, right? They want their absence to be presented. But this is the opposite, right? Is to let Harry die, to be the unnaming of the name, so that he can be nothing but a corpse, right? Okay. Sorry, I don't think that needed to be said as forcefully there. So like it's sort of like pounding a mallet or something.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, anyways, yeah, if it's getting hot, I'm getting close to the finish line here. And what one should add then, that what's interesting about this film, and this is explicitly treated, is that in the presence of the law, so there is a lawman who's actually a kind of comical figure himself because he's sort of a fool, this guy Calvin Wiggs. In the presence of the law, it's recognized that the law itself then doesn't doesn't punish because of guilt, but is precisely that which produces guilt. I mean, it's explicit. So that the very, in other words, the opening shots, the 3 gunshots are illegal, and it's rendered legal because of just an arbitrary rule to say that it's illegal to shoot on posted land. And the reason why he's posted the land is simply to produce an income, right? That he needs, because he gets paid by piecework, right? So that
Produce what, sorry?
to produce an income for himself, because he gets paid piecework. It's quite funny. He gets paid by the arrest, right? So that like even the lawman hears only interest in the corpse, right? So that he would be the only figure that really actually maybe takes an interest in the corpse, or in his own idiotic way tries to investigate. He's not much of a detective, but he takes an interest because he will actually then ultimately get paid. It has nothing to do actually with the person of Harry, right? Even the lawman, but the lawman nonetheless pretends that he cares about Harry. Everybody else just simply doesn't, right? Least of all his wife, right? Which is quite hilarious, right? Because she'd be somebody that one would expect that she would actually care somewhat for Harry, but on the contrary, as Captain Wiles says, she's hysterical with joy when she identifies Harry. And there's a lot of great dialogue sort of dealing with this. Okay, so, and maybe I'll get to a little bit of that dialogue. So let me then, the moral universe then, the task of the law then is to not only preserve but to create the moral universe in the film where guilt is produced. But it only does so, we could say, at the cost of expelling the one that does not belong, that cannot be placed under the law, which is the corpse. Right? So that the law cannot think the corpse qua corpse, it can only think it as Harry, a person that's been, murdered, absented, and that it wants to retain that absence and vindicate it, right? To punish those who have made that absence. This is my argument. So in the film, the corpse is no longer a corpse, right? Because of its formal presentation. It's in fact a very well-dressed corpse at that. We could look at a picture. And Harry is no longer Harry, right? Because of the unnaming of the name as I treated. And it's precisely to this disjunctive synthesis that the viewer's gaze is to be directed, right? So the gaze is what I'm arguing is not simply to this identical person, Harry, that is a corpse, but the place that is displaced when one sees that he cannot be identified either qua corpse, and that's in the sense of just a dead subject, or Harry. So marking a present, so our gaze is to be directed to this disjunctive synthesis, marking a present absence rather than an absent presence. A point dramatically punctuated by the first sequence in which we approach Harry's well-dressed corpse from Arnie's point of view, right? Which is interesting. This is Jerry Mathers, as a matter of fact, which at least some from my generation will know from the Leave It to Beaver fame. So Arnie's point of view, a scene that culminates in an extremely foreshortened shot, so here we have, in which we see the bottom of Harry's upturned shoes, right? So it's funny because it's the only thing vertical about Harry. And they're soon to be stolen by a passing hobo. Intersect with Arnie's torso, right? So it's a very bizarre shot, in part because the way it's foreshortened makes one think that, and it's only because of Arnie's size, that it's in fact, those could be his legs and the torso of Arnie, right? It could be one body, a body sitting up looking at itself. This is how I'm interpreting it. But I think it's clearly produced by the effect of foreshortening. So armed with his ray gun, Arnie peers down, right, which actually is an instrument to warp space. So armed with his ray gun, Arnie peers down at what can only, that we can only deduce to be from prior images, because we don't see what in fact he's looking at. We can't see the face. So we can only deduce it to be Harry's artfully bloodied head. The peculiarity of this shot consists in the extremely narrow angle of view, even more extreme than Mantegna's The Lamentation of Christ. So the painting that we probably know, that one extreme perspective of Christ, which creates the illusion that Harry's legs could in fact be those of Arnie, or conversely, as if Arnie's downcast gaze could in fact belong to the corpse itself. So, as we triangulate it, it's as if then, if we interpret this as the corpse looking at itself, we are positioned in the place of Arnie, which has already been established, because it's one of the few times where we actually get a point of view shot where Arnie is clearly approaching the corpse and we're in the position of Arnie, and then suddenly we cut to a point of view in which we see Arnie looking at himself, right? Which is of course not himself, but the very split object-subject Harry Warp. So this extremely narrow angle of view, which creates the illusion that Harry's legs could in fact be those of Arnie, or conversely, as if Arnie's downcast gaze could in fact belong to the corpse itself. This distortion of perspective has the effect of excising depth, right? The flattening of space, making it impossible to discern the distance, right, between Arnie's vertical position and that of Harry's horizontal, right? So that we can't actually place the space between the two figures. The effect of their intersection is only broken when Arnie turns to fetch his mother, Jennifer Rogers, played by Shirley MacLaine, who is, as I already suggested, hysterical with delight when she appears. And her son Arnie asks her, right? So this is a conversation that takes place over the corpse. So I'll just read it rather than watch it, because it will take maybe too much time. So he says, why don't he get up and move? I don't think I'm doing a good imitation, but why don't he get up and move? He's asleep, she replies. He's in a deep sleep, a deep, wonderful sleep. How did he hurt his head? Putting it where it wasn't wanted would be my guess. Will it get better? Not if we're lucky. Let's run home and I'll make you some lemonade. Will lemonade put me in a wonderful, deep, deep sleep, Mummy? No, Arnie, but it's better than no lemonade. I don't understand that. Never mind. Forget you saw him. Is there a special way to forget? Just think of something else. I'll try not to see him tomorrow. That's a good boy, Arnie. Okay. Now it's only later in the film that we can make sense of this strange response. I'll not see him okay, so just think of something else, and his reply to that is, okay, I'll try not to see him tomorrow. Now shortly thereafter, it is only later that we see that this makes a strange sense. We could say a warped sense, a kind of nonsense. Later in the film, the characters, and later in the film, or at the end of the film, the characters itself will appeal to this warped sense in order to evade the grip of the law, thinking of a reason why the police were not informed before now, right? So they restore the corpse to the place, but they now have to come up with a ground or a reason to deviate, to evade the law. They have to come up with that reason in order to justify why this duration passed. And they do so by staging a second encounter between Arnie and Harry. Right? So they put him back in the same place, and then they watch Harry approach the corpse and re-encounter it. And it's Harry's, and it's Arnie's, as his mother puts it, strange sense of timing, right? Which cues us into the weird sense of suspense. Strange sense of timing, as his mother puts it, that comes to the rescue. It is Arnie who has mastered the art of forgetting. This is what I'm claiming. As we learn from an exchange between Marlowe and Arnie, and this is another dialogue. So Marlowe says they're having this sort of funny exchange, and Marlowe, who plays an artist in the film, and if I had a chance to go on indefinitely, which would obviously, I'm coming very close to the end. I can't tell if I'm actually going for a long time or not. Okay, but anyways, yeah, anyways. No, I'm literally very close. Sorry, anyways, okay, so let me just quickly do it. So it is Harney's strange sense of timing, as his mother puts it, that comes to the rescue. And there's this dialogue between Marlowe and Arnie. So Marlowe says to him, perhaps I'll come back tomorrow, because Marlowe basically has used the corpse as an occasion to hit on Arnie's mother. And the one thing that I haven't sort of said is that the corpse does produce precisely these relations of desire amongst the characters. So that there's two relations that are birthed over the contingent encounter with the corpse. So Marlowe says, perhaps I'll come back tomorrow, and Arnie says, when's that? The day after today. That's yesterday. This is Arnie. That's yesterday. Today's tomorrow. Marlowe says, it was. When was tomorrow yesterday, Mr. Marlowe? Today. Oh, sure, yesterday. Miss Rogers, you'll never make sense of Arnie. He has his own timing. So for Arnie, today is tomorrow, since yesterday was today, and tomorrow will be yesterday. Arnie's relation to the time forecloses then any sense of the future, right? Which is precisely the position of the corpse, right? The corpse, it's a pure present without future, right? Condemned, just simply condemned to decay. So Arnie's relation to time forecloses a future that is related to a present that is determined by a past. So like Harry, internally foreclosed from the future because dead, Harry's present is eternally displaced within the difference that opens between the person he was and the corpse he has become. And it is Arnie who is tasked with maintaining Harry's suspense, the suspension over the void, seeing the absence before his very eyes. Thank you.